Good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to this critical engagement webinar series in which we discuss, debate, and evaluate the ever-changing body of knowledge emerging as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic. The series probes pandemic innovations, responses, and partnerships. My name is Aviwe Mgobozi, and I'm the host for this afternoon. After earning my Bachelor of Clinical Medical Practice degree and a postgrad diploma in Health Science Education at WITS, I undertook an MPhil in Health Professions Education at Stellenbosch. I now currently work as a lecturer in the WITS Department of Family Medicine and Primary Care in the Division of Clinical Associates. I'm hosting today with the WITS team in the Department of Family Medicine and Primary Care, alongside with the Health System Sciences and the Adler Museum of Medicine. This weekly series is inspired by the image, characteristics, and survival story of the Cape pangolin, and this webinar seeks to unpack the interconnectedness of health, humanities, environment, and sciences through a lens of health systems thinking. In today's live discussion, titled Pandemic Innovations, we are thrilled to have two experts, Hutiri and Glaudina Loots. Our first speaker is Hutiri. Hutiri is an engineer turned social entrepreneur, chasing purpose, meaning, and impact. Growing up in Mafikeng, in South Africa's Northwest Province, Neo was always curious about creating new things. He graduated from University of Cape Town with the BSc in Electrical Engineering. He then worked in the steel manufacturing industry as an automation engineer. He later worked for ArcelorMittal while also completing a master's in industrial engineering at WITS. Following this, he ventured into the technology startup scene in Johannesburg, nurturing his interest in locally made technology. When he was diagnosed with TB in 2014, Neo was frustrated by the long waiting times to pick up medication. He then started his medical technology company called Technovera in 2016, a social tech business developing smart solutions in the public health care space. Neo developed the Billy Box, a solution that enables patients to collect repeat medication in seconds instead of waiting for hours. He is an Ashoka Fellow and winner of the 2019 Africa Prize for Engineering Innovation by the Royal Academy of Engineering. The second speaker is Glaudina Loots. Glaudina is the Director for Health Innovation at the Department of Science and Technology. She's responsible for enabling research and innovation that leads to discovery and evaluation of new drugs, treatment regimes, the development of new vaccines, and the development of medical devices. She serves on the South African National Health Research Committee, the South African National AIDS Council, and is a member of the Ministerial Committee on Antimicrobial Resistance. Glaudina is also a board member of the BioVac Institute, a public-private partnership aimed at the local manufacturing of vaccines and biologics. Glaudina was also responsible for the South African Woman in Science Awards. The speakers will share their insights about innovation around the time of pandemic, with the specific focus on how crisis drives innovation. Neo will be the first speaker, sharing his perspective on an innovator within a South African healthcare system context, and Glaudina will speak next about a perspective of health innovation and looking beyond 2020. We are delighted to have you both here. Our format is that our speakers will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then I will lead us to a question and answer session. Thank you once again. Over to you, Neo Hutiri.
Hello, everybody. I'm just going to turn on my quick slide. Okay, so perfect. Okay, my name is Neo. I am an engineer by training. Currently practicing as a technology social impact entrepreneur, and I started a company called Technovera that ended up being a way for us to be able to create innovations that we think are desperately needed, with a particular focus in the public healthcare space. So the work that we technically do is focused on one very, very niche area, which is reducing the average waiting time for patients that are collecting chronic medication at healthcare facilities in Southern Africa. As Aviwe mentioned, I found my way into healthcare by accident or by fate, depending on how you look at it. So in 2014, on the 3rd of Jan, just after New Year's, I went to see I went to one of my local clinics, and I was diagnosed with TB. And I received the news that I need to start this treatment cycle for about 6 months for me to be able to get well. And I think at that point, it was one of these things where you think, why is this happening? Okay, let me start this treatment. Let me try and be on course to be able to sort of beat TB. And I had read everything about TB being one of the biggest killers, but also knowing that it can be stopped if one takes their treatment quite well. So like millions of South Africans, I started my treatment cycle, and I was going to my local clinic every second week, sorry, and then subsequently to that every month. I got a really strong rude awakening of the fact that as a patient in the public healthcare space, you are waiting a significant amount of time when you have to go repeat or collect your repeat script. I was one of those deeply frustrated patients that kept on complaining up until somebody said, you know what, what can you do about this particular scenario? And at that time, I had just finished a project looking at debottlenecking systems. And I started looking at this particular clinic as a potential bottleneck and wondering what can be done within this particular context. So the context that we looked at was the fact that, you know, we've got about 11.8 million people that are on chronic conditions or chronic medication that are collecting treatment on a monthly basis. We've got a population, or 84% of the population is reliant on state-funded care. And I think what was quite interesting for my journey was the fact that plus minus 70% of the daily script fulfilled within a public healthcare fraternity is mostly for chronic condition. And depending on which part of the country you look at, a patient can be waiting anything from 30 minutes to about 7 hours on a queue, with the average being about 3.5 hours. And sort of armed with this, I kept on thinking to myself that we can't be a country which has the biggest burden of ARV, where we've really done well in terms of putting a lot of people on treatment, but having our public healthcare fraternities that are somewhat decongested. And started thinking to myself in terms of like how can all of this engineering knowledge and process design try and be put to good use. The original goal was to service myself, which was trying to get a patient who's collecting a treatment in about 3.5 hours to be able to access their treatment in about 2 minutes. A lot of people kept on saying, it's not even the 10x impact that people are talking about. It's multiples worth of impact. This was sort of the goal. Ended up reaching out to any municipality that would listen to me. And finally, City of Tshwane said, maybe, we're willing to listen. And came up with a concept of saying, how can we use technology to be able to facilitate chronically stable patients, so meaning patients who are collecting the same repeat treatment and are classified as chronically stable, meaning that they're responding to treatment that they're on. So we ended up coming up with this concept called Pele Box. Simply put, Pele in Setswana means, or has 3 meanings. So kwa pele. So the context was to be able to put a patient at the front of the queue digitally, and to be able to put them at the front of anything that we do, so at the center. So what we ended up looking at these digital lockers, or manufacturing these digital lockers, that we're able to then take pre-packed medicine, load it inside. It sends an SMS to a patient saying, "No, your medication is ready for collection. Here's a one-time PIN." Simply, the patient, when they come to collect, They don't have to go to the front of the queue or the front of the clinic or collect a file, and so on and so on. So they effectively just come to the self-service unit and enter their cell phone number, enter their PIN that we send to them via SMS. It authenticates, and then one of these doors pops open. They're then able to collect their medicine. So I guess my journey within the innovation sort of context was one of, I guess, being an outsider within the healthcare fraternity, and somewhat saying, if you look at this particular challenge, it has multiple contributors, but what is a solution that can be able to contribute significantly to ensuring that our population that are managing their conditions don't end up feeling that they are always disadvantaged by the amount of time that it takes. And I guess maybe in the context of the conversation today, it is about innovation, and it's about making sure that we build context relevant innovations. So somebody might argue that, you know, being able to have electronics that pop open doors at the right sort of authentication protocols might not be as like the grand innovations, but if you really try and think about it in the context of, let's say, 7.2 million people that are accessing their treatment on a monthly basis, and if you are able to take all of those people from 3.5 hours in a queue to a couple of seconds, leveraging technology, it is a multiplier. It's quite significant. And within the context of COVID, what was quite fortuitous for the work that we do was that a lot of people were somewhat disheartened in terms of having to go spend so much time in queues at clinics and potentially increasing their risk of contracting COVID by being in a population or being in a particular facility that is densely populated and has high volumes of people. And we found that models like self-service in the context of certain offerings within the public healthcare space become quite practical and become quite relevant as well. And in the context of wanting to build a healthcare that is patient-centric and that puts the patient at the heart of everything that we do, we find that technology can be able to sort of cut across a lot of the language and a lot of the barriers that are there. You know, small things when you start to say, you know what, we have a country that has 11 official languages. How do you make sure that you can still and ensure that anybody who needs to use this particular technology works? And our design principles and our design theme around innovation was make it simple, make it dependable, and just make it work. And you find that anybody who understands numbers 0 to 9 is able to enter cell phone number, is able to enter 5-digit PIN, and action happens and somebody's able to collect from your 80-year-old patient to your, I don't know, your 13-year-old patient who's effectively coming to collect. You find that if you build innovation that is contextually aware of all of the different parameters, you find that you can find a sweet spot for innovations to be able to thrive. And I think maybe what I also want to talk about is the change in climate that I guess COVID has sort of brought on within the healthcare space, in particular within the public healthcare sector. You find that a lot of things that used to take a lot longer through COVID, at least most of our officials have found ways to be able to expedite, be able to make sure that things move faster. I mean, a very good example would have been, you know, like if you think about a clinic, one of the biggest challenges is the filing management system. And we've had, you know, patient records management systems for such a long time. And they haven't permeated all of the facilities. But you find that whenever the logic is, you know, if you're going to be handling all of these pieces of paper, which is the files, and each and every patient has to handle their file, move it from station to station, then all of a sudden you start realizing that actually if the patients and the staff are touching the same sort of point, you end up as a potential infection area. And being able to then have officials saying, actually, how do we expedite the adoption of simple technologies that have been around, such as electronic patient record management within all of our public healthcare facilities. And I think that has created a lot of opportunity for us to think around what is required, how do we build paperless environments? How do we integrate different pieces of technology into the space? How do we apply differentiated care models in such a way that patients have options and patients are put at the center of how service can be delivered? And I think innovation is now at a point where receptivity is super high, and people are so open within spaces where doors have ultimately either taken long to open or have taken long to be able to get the right audience. And as an innovator on the ground, I find this quite a really interesting opportunity, a space where if one has a good solution that has drastic social impact and can be able to leverage technology. Obviously, what this taught us is if you're able to manufacture your product here, as we do, it becomes quite easy for you to still be able to fend off the challenges that come with supply chains that are really long and extended. I think I've been speaking for 12 minutes. I might just be over my time, so I think I'll park. I'll hand over to Aviwe just now.
Thank you very much, Neil. I shall then hand over to our second speaker, Glaudina Loots.
Good day. It is a privilege to be able to talk to you. Neo is really one of the young people that show that we collectively can find solutions for our problems, and that we do not need to be dependent on imported technologies, because a number of times those imported technologies are actually not appropriate for what we are doing. Next slide. So up to this point, we've been from Department of Science and Innovation. We actually used the South African Medical Research Council to assist us through the Strategic Health Innovation Partnership, or SHIP as we call it, to drive innovation in the health arena. And we're looking at your new drugs and improved drugs for priority diseases, vaccines, biologics, diagnostics, medical devices, clinical research, and then also at the same time, you're looking at the manufacturing component around that. Next. So that is where we start looking at, and what is very important, that we have to be aware of what is going on around it. So the fourth industrial revolution is very much part of it. And when you start looking at that, it is sort of the disruption of jobs. And I think COVID actually really emphasized the problems that we have on almost the self-centeredness became more central, but also we need to, the inequality. I think if you start looking at those core things, ethics became a problem. But within that, innovation is actually one of the binding elements that we need to start looking at. How can we then actually still serve the people of the country as such? Next. So, yeah, SARS-CoV-2 struck us. And then suddenly we were all nicely ensconced in the work that we are doing, research projects that is going forward. And suddenly there's no PPE, there's no ventilators. Things such as the common panado suddenly is threatened. We do not have sufficient supplies for 4 months. And then diagnostics. And we all know how the whole problem became around the actual diagnostic kits that's needed to identify people with COVID-19. And we actually in the end we were not able to test as many people as we want, and we have to start really limiting who should be tested. And in that process, a number of people might have been left out that actually do have the disease as such. And up to this point still, we don't know what percentage South Africans actually had COVID-19. And we're still just working on what is available. There's still an international shortage of your reagents for that. So in order to see what we could do, we immediately, because of the lockdown, a number of research projects could not go further. And or were stopped for at least 12 months. So we immediately saw what funding were then made available, what can we sort of postpone, and made that money available and start looking at networks that's been built up through the Strategic Health Innovation Partnership, through SHIP, and look at what clinical research do we need to immediately start doing, what surveillance, what do we need to know about the disease, where is it going, what is happening. Then combined with that, to look at to understand the genomics of the disease, not only whether the virus is actually mutating or which specific variations do we have in South Africa, but also to understand your host genetics, to understand how the COVID is actually functioning within the human body. We cannot assume that what is being tested in America or in Europe is actually then applicable, and we have to start looking at what make it unique in South Africa. Why is our epidemic not the same as that of America or Europe as such? So we're looking at that. But at the same time, we have to start looking at new treatment modalities. What drugs could be repurposed? How do you treat somebody differently? For example, the way that the doctor started to treat the patients in hospitals, and then became actually international breakthrough, that you put a person on his stomach and not on the back, and how that actually changed the whole dynamic and the survival rates and around that. And then because we do have access to the specific samples, we then start looking at antibodies, the role that antibodies is playing, what can we do about future treatments utilizing antibodies, and we're also looking at vaccines. And it's very essential when you start looking at the potential COVID vaccines, of which there's more than 240 being internationally developed, which ones will actually be appropriate from for South Africa, which ones can we start having the confidence that will still provide a protection for the South African population and not exacerbate some other diseases and such. So it's very important that we actually do test those potential vaccines in the South African populations as well. So immediately we used the networks, the funding instruments that was there, and then just redirected in order to address the COVID issues as such. So you all know about the success we had about the CPAP ventilators, that we use 3D printing to actually start producing those ventilators. And one of the interesting things is how the private sector and academia then actually got together, and we had sort of weekly meetings where we say, okay, fine, how can we advance the whole, how can we advance specific projects through the system as such? So we also worked closely with the regulatory environment and the regulators to see how we can then assist that. But what is very essential is that we now going forward, we're still in COVID, but we need to start looking at the impact that COVID had on other diseases and how it actually will start affecting us going forward. So it is essential then that we say, what now? What is the next steps, and what is still important for South Africa? Next. So what we've really seen is the things that is driving health innovation is the unsustainable rise of cost. If you start looking at what new treatments cost, and the with the new technologies also bring a lot of extra costs that was not necessarily factored in, and how can you actually alleviate that cost, and using your Internet of Things, and for that then to bring down those costs. So your digitization becomes very much a part of the way we're going forward. And I think, as been demonstrated by the pillar box, very simple way of SMS or your WhatsApp that you can use and actually provide a service, in the process freeing up healthcare workers, freeing up essential pharmacist people, and provide a better service as such. And what we've seen through COVID is actually the really rapid evolution around science and medicine. And how do we actually utilize it? How do we ensure that what is happening is still appropriate for South Africa, is still appropriate for Africa, and make sure that we do not lose out and that we do not become stepchildren in the whole development process. So that is sort of going forward. We need to see how do we address it. Next slide. So you need to look at things like your financial sustainability, especially going forward after the knock that COVID has given the South Africa and the world as such. How do we actually keep on affording to provide good healthcare services? You need to look at what are the consumer needs, demands, expectation. How do we actually be able to address it? And this is where Neo's invention is actually so spot on, because this is really addressing that need of, I need to get my chronic medication, but don't need to go and sit in a clinic. And those kind of things is what we really need to start looking at. So new healthcare delivery models as such, that is demonstrated as well. And then how do you use then your digital innovation and transformation in this whole process of providing better services? But very essential, we need to look at your regulatory compliance and cybersecurity to make sure that that patient record is actually still securing the information from that patient and it cannot be utilized or fall in the wrong hands as such. Next. So you need to look at your decrease of cost. How do we do it? Improve the ways to diagnosis and treatment, improve your disease management. Your remote monitoring of chronic disease is becoming very, very essential now. You enhance your patient's experience and you improve your drug management as such. Next. So from science and innovation side going forward, what we are looking into and where we're going to spend a lot of time and finances on is to start looking at your new treatment and prevention technologies. When you start looking at your smart drugs, your precision medicine, your finding TB solutions that's actually applicable to that specific version of, for example, multi-drug TB. And what are the technologies, digital technologies and precision medicine technologies that we can then use for that? How can we take that handful of pills and actually start reducing it to just one pill a day and use your nanotechnologies and actually bring that down to enhance the patient experience, but at the same time also make sure that the treatment as such is more applicable for that person. Next. So one of the things that worldwide is got a lot of airtime as such is around precision medicine. But when you start talking about precision medicine within a resource scarce environment, then you need to start looking at how do you actually utilize your technologies? How do you utilize your big data? How do you understand genetic setup within a country? And you can actually tailor-made those specific treatments to make sure that they actually do provide what is necessary. So what we are doing is utilize then the diagnostic tools that can be developed, but still to address issues around HIV, TB, malaria, chronic diseases within an African environment. And how do we make sure that the treatments that is being offered as standard is actually really appropriate for your populations that they are being used in? We found that a number of your standard treatments are actually not really applicable to certain population groups, and we have to make sure that we actually then can calibrate that is actually really serving the purpose that it's supposed to do. Next. So your issues around understanding the patient, understanding the patient record, understanding patient management, and assisting the doctors within that. How do we utilize your big data, your artificial intelligence, blockchain for your patient record, and then also at the same time your augmented reality to train people on how to do certain things, even to train the doctors on how to do your physical your surgery and issues like that. And how do we actually bring that back into making sure that patient care is better and faster and more appropriate for for a specific person? Next. And then we've also got your robotics that we need to see how do we bring that in. And to a certain extent, the pillar box has got components of robotics as well, because you are putting in a number and a certain component actually start operating. And this is how do we start using those kind of things. 3D printing becomes more and more important, where we actually able to print missing parts of a person's skeleton, a jaw or something like that, where we can actually start printing that and make it appropriate for that person, and that your prostheses that they are using are really specific for that person, and we can enhance the quality of life of that person. But at the same time, we also need to look at the cost and how we can bring that down. And the interesting technologies is now to start looking at the printing of drugs specifically, and to what extent is that an appropriate technology that we can use in Africa and should be pursuing. So those are the kind of things. And I think that drones, it's not being utilized so much in South Africa, but in Rwanda, that is really one of the examples how to utilize drones then to do your service delivery, to pick up blood samples, to go and drop off polls, and how do you actually start using those kind of technologies. Next. So when you start looking at all of those things, we need to see how do we bring better, cleverer healthcare to the patient, and how do we make sure that we can enhance the services of the doctors, but enhance them themselves as well, and bring it all together and see how we can learn from the bad components of COVID and actually build further on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Glaudina. Thank you to Nero. I think it was a very nice, we had two perspectives, where we had the perspective from the Department of Science and Technology, as you outlined what you look out for with regards to the innovations, and also hearing amazing work done by Nero from an innovator who's coming with homegrown solutions that are beneficial to our communities. And I'm sure that our patients are saying good remarks from that experience. To the audience, please may you send us a few questions. You're more than welcome to type in the chat space. We already have some questions coming through. We have a question from Wilson. So Wilson is asking, what impact has COVID-19 had on decision-making for the South African National Health Insurance? Can both guests please respond from their experience?
I think that's a very good question. I'll sort of answer it in two parts. So at least my experience is I saw a lot of examples. So I work, well, we do work with Gauteng Department of Health together with KZN Department of Health and Western Cape and Northwest, sort of the four provinces that we mostly have significant contributions in. And it was super interesting how all of a sudden senior officials within the Department of Health would be able to call on to different technology providers and different thought leaders into one room. I mean, I remember having a particular experience where the Gauteng Department of Health called all of the different innovators that are looking at healthcare systems into one room, and we went and discussed different challenges that exist. Maybe an example that I gave would have been like different partners that are looking at patient records management, trying to understand what is the most quickest ways for us to be able to make sure that we abolish the usage of paper in a primary healthcare setting. And I guess maybe not necessarily decision making, but very much that creating an environment where the high ranking officials are willing to listen and they're willing to ask grassroots innovators, different corporates, different partners to say, here's a particular challenge. I will effectively leave this particular group of people to say, how do you come up with a solution around it? And I found COVID creating experiences like that to be a very, very good indicator of how decisions and consultation of stakeholders have a significant contribution to make, even if they don't necessarily work for the ministry directly. They're able to sort of come to the party and contribute. And then maybe within the national health insurance sort of framework and what we're building out too, I think it became real for all of us how differentiated services of care, being able to create a vision where if a local GP has the ability to be able to serve that particular patient, do we need to have that particular patient going to the clinic, which is already decongested? And all of these provisions are technically already built into NHI. And it's about seeing how, if they were already real, how could we have been able to activate the scenario? And I mean, in the background, there was all these conversations around if you had found a mechanism to be able to contract GPs in communities, you would have been able to create so many testing stations across so many facilities without having to have a bottleneck of certain public healthcare clinics being the only test stations that can be able to screen and test people. So all of these things were at play. It is probably about how do we carry them through into realization. And I think what was real for me was how all of the provisions that are within NHI already account for things like this.
Thank you, Nemo. There is a question for Glaudina. This is a question from Sean. It says, please provide details of the strategic health, etc., which was mentioned. Is it a program established recently?
SHIP actually is situated with African Medical Research Council within their innovation component. If you go onto the website and type SHIP, there you will actually be directed to that. So that we're also working with the IDC, Department of Trade and Industry, as well as the Technology Innovation Agency. We will then look at what are the components around innovation and how can we actually then assist as such. What we've created also is a medical device and diagnostic cluster where we assist then companies and young innovators then to go through the process of actually then be able to really innovate, to answer questions. We also bring them in contact with your medical personnel to see what are the burning questions that healthcare personnel would like answers to, and then bring the innovators to that, and then see to what extent we can actually help them to do the innovations and provide the necessary funding. It also links back to your venture capitalists. So it's a whole program that the starting point is SHIP at the Medical Research Council, and then it goes into a whole longer network as such. So there was also a question around what kind of people do we need? We need people that can integrate genomics with your pharmacology combined with ICT. And if you've got sort of those kind of skills, that is the way forward to go, because we are really trying to develop technologies and treatments that will actually assist. For example, one of the things that we have funded was actually to start looking at breast cancer and how can we bring down the cost of the BRCA test for breast cancer from your 20,000 Rand. We've actually now been able to bring the testing cost for the diagnostic down to 2,000 Rand. And we're still looking at how can we further then roll it out. But at the same time, the test was adapted to South African population so that we know that when we do those tests, it is actually applicable, that the medication then that goes with it is actually appropriate. So when a woman needs a Herceptin, that you can actually know that that specific, it will work within that person's genetic setup. So those are the kind of people that can provide components of that. That is the way forward, not only in South Africa, but internationally as well.
Thank you, Glaudina. Neil, I'll also ask the same question for you. There is a question that says, I am currently in my final year of a Bachelor of Health Science degree, and they majored in pharmacology. So they'd like to know what degree or undergrad or postgrad would you advise them to do to follow your path of work? I think you're on mute now.
Yes. So I think this one is it's always a difficult one to answer, primarily because I think I've always advocated for balance. So balance in my context would have been at least doing a portion of your career when you're doing, and then maybe another portion of your career while you're also learning. I'd always advocate for being able to get, or at least take a step and be out of academia for a little bit while and actually go into practitioner mode. And that can take different forms. It doesn't matter whether it is working in a healthcare setting, working in a healthcare startup, working in a tech sort of organization that is in the area of space that you want to operate in, and then potentially, once having a really good footing in terms of what's happening on the ground, being able to complement that with a second degree or with a master's part. I guess what I found in my journey is that there's a high degree of effectuation. So meaning that whatever step you take, or whatever lens that you contribute. So I mean, I find myself spending a lot of time in pharmacies right now. But I probably look at pharmacy processes mostly within a systems or an industrial engineering sort of lens. And that has a role to sort of play because it does contribute to a different lens on how one looks at things. You know, if I'm coming into a particular clinic and I'm looking at how much medicine we're still throwing away within a public healthcare clinic, maybe versus how much food Woolworths is throwing away within fresh perishable goods. It is about saying, okay, if you're coming into it with an engineering lens, you might look at it from how do we build processes that are required to be able to address this particular problem. So I don't have a direct answer in terms of saying this is what I think you need to go look at, but there is my contribution would definitely be able to say, whatever you still decide to do, bringing that lens into the context of what is happening on the ground really is something that contributes to how innovation can sort of thrive, and then be able to apply and build a really strong practice. I think that is a very big component of what our country is needing and looking for at the moment.
Thank you, Nero. There's a question for Glaudina. Anya's asking, why has South Africa not invested in establishing labs that can design and manufacture vaccines?
Anya, you're wrong. At UCT, there's actually quite a lot of work happening as such around the design of vaccine. It is not only they were working on HIV vaccines, but they're also working on the human papillomavirus vaccines, plus a number of other things. So Professor Annelies Williamson and Professor Ed Robicki, they are the leaders in that thing. Then at the CSIR, we are funding a number of projects there. And one of the interesting technologies is actually to use your plant-based expression systems then for the vaccines. If you look at the news, you will see that one of the companies for COVID vaccine called Medicago is actually talking about their vaccines as going into phase 2 clinical trials. And that's actually where they're using tobacco plants to express the proteins that's needed for a vaccine. And we actually do have those technologies in South Africa, and we actually do encourage that. Then we also have BioVac that is in the process of developing a vaccine for group B streptococcus, as well as looking at the manufacturing component then of specific vaccines, including in discussions around the secondary manufacturing around COVID vaccines. So yes, there's actually quite a lot of that happening, most of it under the radar. But yes, there's, and if you need more of you, if you need introduction to those people, I will most probably help you with that. And Sean, also, if you can let me know, I can send you more information around it, if you can give me your email address.
Thank you, Glaudina. There is a question for Nero. It says, how do you think university education programs should respond, especially in the time of COVID, to this need for innovation and the link to engineering? What one course would you add to the current degrees?
Yeah, I think I also have a critical opinion on this one. So at least when I think about engineering, and probably even some of the business degrees that we have in the country, I find that it is so interesting that we don't put practice as one of the top sort of activities. I'll give you a very good example of maybe something that I'm critical about is it's so easy in South Africa within the healthcare space to get, let's say, a couple of MBA students from Madrid, from Yale, from wherever, coming to spend, I don't know, 5 weeks in an organization and wanting to figure out how they can contribute their knowledge or even improve their knowledge. But if you are trying to get a university in South Africa to try and do something like that, and where you're not going to be struggling with context, people understand the problems that we're facing and they probably connect to them, that's not something that is built into the way that we teach or within the programs that we offer. And I do think that being able to build in a higher component of context-driven learning is something that I think is required and probably a sort of a low-hanging fruit that one can do. And it doesn't matter whether it is about taking students to different organizations and giving them context on how innovation sort of comes about, or potentially being able to pair up innovators with people in their journey of getting into programs. I do think that if you look at sort of maybe the American mentality of, do things and learn quite quickly, I think we try and only learn right later in our careers and our journeys. I look at programs in universities as a space that probably needs to change that, and rather get entrepreneurial minds sort of pushing for entrepreneurship. Educational sort of programs pushing for entrepreneurship and pushing for people to try and create and develop and try and put things out there. Even if all of them are not going to work, even if 90% of them don't work, but just creating that boldness of a South African fabric that is willing to go out there and try and not necessarily wait for things to happen through a normal sort of career progression, I guess.
Thank you, Nera. This question is to both speakers. I'll start with you, Glaudina. It says, often technological innovation can address shortcomings within systems. However, with new technologies or innovation, new sets of challenges emerge. Has the context of COVID shifted the way you think about the systems challenge that emerge out of the rapid change?
COVID, not so much. It was we were already thinking about it before COVID, so it was actually easier then to respond to COVID as such. So what is essential when you look at any innovation, you have to look at the impact it will have across the system. What will it do to the workflow within a clinic or a hospital? And how do you then work that into the training of the healthcare personnel? And so right from the start, what we are doing is we bring in the end users of potential technologies as well, so that we can start looking at how do we address those issues at the same time, and not just, yes, a technology, start using it, but how do we integrate it into the healthcare service delivery component right from the start, and what are the issues. For example, one of the things a couple of years ago, we funded the development of a microbicide for HIV, and one of the important things is to actually start discussions with the end users, the women, to what extent they will actually use it and whether it is actually socially acceptable. And you have to bring those discussions in far early in the design process already, in order to make sure that your technology will actually have some uptake as such. So it's very much part of the way that we're looking at the whole system and what the impact will be as such. So when COVID happened, we were able to already bring in those components already. Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
think I think
No,
I
would
think
you like
my
to
yeah.
answer that? Okay.
I think my contribution to that is maybe piggyback of the point that was mentioned by Glaudina, is that when COVID helped us understand what systems we had built, but had not accelerated the adoption of at a national level. And all of a sudden it started pointing to why is it that the impact um, of um, of access to medicine in KZN is not as heartfelt as in Northwest, for instance. And then you started realizing that certain programs that we were implementing in KZN ended up helping us in catching a lot of the weight that was sort of became visible in other parts of the country. And then maybe the second part about from a systems perspective, I do agree with the view that technology does create changes, and those changes sometimes can create problems. But it is about the design. It is about saying, if you are implementing a new innovation or a new technology, one of the components of implementation or change management is being able to look at unintended consequences and being able to figure out how do you build mitigation strategies for those as well. And often enough, it is about spending time on the ground, understanding within a nuclear sort of model, creating a system, monitoring it for a period of time, understanding unintended consequences, redeveloping, redesigning before you get into the scale component of that. It is about being diligent at that particular component of assess, and then be able to look at the scale component. And then I think my last parting thought would be the fact that systems are always meant to change continuously. Not changing something just because you're afraid of other changes that will sort of emanate from that is something that that I think is not a good way to sort of look at things. So, for instance, within clinic level or within public healthcare primary care level, you start to understand the role of data privacy very, very strongly when you start to implement certain systems that are helping ease the burden of a particular challenge at a primary healthcare level. You start to understand why is it important that we build systems that have both offline and online operations, because we don't always have such a good, reliable data connection across all of the sites. And that it's almost like you can't stop implementing and innovating just because you're afraid of the unintended consequences that will arise. It is about being bold enough and saying you have to continuously address the questions as they come along.
Thank you, Nero. I'm also going to add, there is a question that is appreciating your work, and they're asking, how does the technology, so the Billy box, accommodate the physical examination and assessment of patients? And secondly, when do you actually start counting the 2 minutes? Is it at the point of keying in your PIN, or does it include the time you spend in the queue while others are waiting to collect their medication? And then they also added, what efforts are being done to market the Billy box in other provinces?
Cool. I'll try and hit them quickly because of time. So first one is physical examination is a clinical process. So we don't use the technology for that. The person, let's say you get a 6-month script. After 6 months, you still have to come back to the clinic. A clinician still has to see you, talk to you, understand how you're doing, understand what has changed in your life, and then be able to draw blood. And that process follows the normal part. So the technology only helps with the mid-cycle collections while your script is still valid. After the script is expired, you then have to come for a clinical examination. And that is a good indicator of being able to use both technology in a portion of a service, and then being able to default back to the physical examination within the traditional version of the process. Second one is that we count from when the person starts typing 082, 861, blah, blah, blah. There is no process before you go to the locker. You don't have to go queue for anything else. You go directly to the machine. We don't have queues in front of the technology at all, so there isn't a queue component over there. Overall time in terms of patient experience, so at the lock itself, it's about 22 seconds for the 3 steps. And then overall within entering the doors of the facility to leaving the doors, it can be anything from 2 to about 3 minutes, provided the person doesn't go and do anything else within the facility as well. And then the last point being marketing. So we, I think the Department of Health is building a strategy for marketing within the next couple of weeks. So we've been feeding information into that. It's not only going to be pillar box, it's also different solutions that the ministry is also implementing.
Thank you, Neil. I'm going to end off with the last question, which is asking Glaudina about what qualification of field study does your line of work require?
Well, the interesting thing is I'm actually a social scientist with the qualification in transdisciplinary health research. And I think that is what is important. If I look at all my colleagues, what we were not bound to one specific discipline. We are able to shift between disciplines and to see from a systems perspective on what is needed. So to me, that is one of the interesting thing is you need to look from an innovation perspective and not from a systems perspective, and not from a very narrow disciplinary perspective. And that is the kind of people that we need. We need pharmacists who can think around genetics. We need your physiotherapists who can still look at what is needed within in a specific innovation environment. It's that sort of thinking out of the box on what are the next thing that will assist somebody, and that's what is needed. So there are a number of technology management courses and things like that, but even that you need to sort of bring in that transdisciplinary aspect to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Glaudina. It is now 2:00. I see there are quite a few questions. I think what we can do, if the speakers don't mind, maybe responding in the chat space, or we'll give it a little bit more time for that. I can ask the last one. Last, we'll say the last one. So the last one is asking, interesting that people who move between fields are crucial for innovation. Do we see this in the private sector more than the public sector? And I think I'll end off with a comment from both of you, and then we're going to close. Would you like to go first, Glaudina?
The innovation, it is sort of, a lot of it's happening at university level, because I think there's sort of not the pressure to actually make money, but we are combining, what we are doing is combining it with industry. So, and this is why we created the clusters, so that you can have your industry needs and different way of thinking combined with your academic knowledge, and then actually start innovating. You also find that your academics are not they're not entrepreneurs necessarily, and you sort of need to get that process where you take something from a university and actually give it to a businessman to take forward and have that further developed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think my contribution to that is that it's technically, I mean, our lifespan is quite long, and there are different phases of our life that will contribute to how we think and what level of risk we want to take. So I guess, let's say in my journey, probably for the early part of my career, it was very much about I'm making sure that I'm a really good engineer and I know what I'm doing and I can build systems that work. But probably, let's say right now, I find myself thinking a lot more with the social, like how do we build a country that we really want and that we deserve? And how do we build systems that can do that? And I will say to that question around private and public, at least within the public sector, I find that there is a lot of multidisciplinarian as well. And it does create a space where things can come alive a lot quicker than maybe just a single track sort of approach, despite the fact that the single track approach is very helpful in terms of depth, but really in terms of implementation and being able to build things that can scale. It is about really, really strong execution professions or skills that are technically implemented within business. I wouldn't say that it only exists in private sector or public. I would probably say it exists in equal. And I've also started to see that there's a lot of professionals or entrepreneurs or people that don't necessarily choose one space or another and allow themselves to move into private and both public, because that transfer of skill from one domain into another also creates a degree of innovation that ultimately the other sector can sort of benefit from.
Thank you very much. We are going to close off. Thank you, Glaudina. Thank you, Nero, for being with us today and sharing really such fascinating insights. Thank you to the audience for joining us. Please do join us next week on Wednesday. That's the 4th of November. So from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock. The Pandemic Pangolins webinar series is going to focus on the actual animal, so the pangolin, and the true story relating to it. So do join us next week. Thank you very much to everyone. Please have a lovely afternoon further.